Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're really thrilled to have you all with us. And so as we wait to let everyone join in, I encourage you to please introduce yourselves in the chat, say hi to your fellow attendees, and perhaps even share where you're joining in from. Before we start, I have a few housekeeping notes for you. The first is that you can leave your comments on the right side of the screen. Second is that to ask questions, please leave them in the Q&A section where the question mark is on the right side of the screen. This will help us address your questions more efficiently. Third, our session is currently being recorded, and so we'll send you guys the recording via email after this webinar in about 1 to 2 business days. In today's webinar, we'll be diving into the latest trends shaping the AI landscape, so what's driving change and what's holding companies back, drawing insights from our survey of 401 senior AI professionals. We'll explore topics such as GenAI budgets, the new use cases emerging across departments and industries, ROI, and more. And Connor, if you can go to the next slide. With us here today are our speakers, our very own Conor Jensen, Global Field CDO at Dataiku, and also Oliver Chiu, Head of Product Marketing for Generative AI at Databricks. They will both be leading the session. And so without further ado, we just wanted to say thank you all for joining us. And now I'll hand it over to you, Conor and Oliver.
Cool. I think, Conor, you're on mute.
This is one of those, it's like, be careful to mute so that you don't create a weird echo and then forget to unmute. So thank you very much, Renata. Good morning, everybody. Oliver, first, let me hand it over to you to do a quick introduction of yourself. Tell us where you're joining from, and then I'll introduce myself and we'll dive in.
Sounds good. Hey, everyone. And nice to see everyone putting in their chat where they're from and where they're coming from. My name is Oliver Chiu. I lead product marketing for GenAI at Databricks. I am from the greater Seattle area. Back to you, Conor.
Awesome. And I'm Conor Jensen. I lead the field CDO team here at Dataiku. We work with sort of our executives and our customers around product strategy, technology roadmaps, things like that. As you guys can all imagine, a lot of that has revolved around generative AI for the last year. So it's exciting to get to sort of talk about some of where we're at with Databricks and some of the recent findings from our survey. And I'm here joining from the Chicago suburbs this morning. So welcome, everybody. Let's go ahead and get dived in. And as Renata said, please throw questions in there in the sidebar as it comes up. We're definitely going to leave space for those at the end. So if anything comes up, please ask it. It'll make it as interactive as possible, and we'll leave as much time for that as we can. All right. So to sort of give a quick preface, the survey report AI Today, which there's, of course, a link and you can download if you haven't already downloaded and read the report. It's really interesting. But to give just a little bit of the sort of background on it so you guys understand who was within this survey and where these responses are coming from. This is our second year. We did this last year. We did it this year of 400 respondents, both of the 2 years. The job titles really ranged last year from manager, director, VP up to the C-suite. This year had a little bit more interaction, and we actually were sort of from the director up level. So primarily focusing on people who are just in decision-making positions within the generative AI space, right? But this can be, as I'm sure many of you guys who have joined will represent, from all sorts of different departments, right? There are IT teams managing the infrastructure or doing some of this work. There are people in data and analytics teams, obviously, like building and working with these tools. There's executives who are thinking about how they're using it for their companies, people in the line of business who are actually sort of in the day-to-day trenches. And so we really have a wide swath of the departments who are here. We had a good split. It was a little bit dominated by the US. So about 60% of respondents from the US, a third from the EU, and then the last 10% from the APAC region. And on average, the company size was greater than $3 billion a year in revenue. We were very focused here on the enterprise space, where how this is being applied. And more than half of the respondents are actually in the $10 billion revenue plus, right? So, big share from primarily enterprise, large scale companies, but it should hopefully give a good cross section of companies across industries, across departments and functions within those companies. And hopefully you'll see yourself in these results. So let's actually dive in and start. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to share the data, some of the findings. We'll talk a little bit about sort of the now what, right? Like, here's the current state, what's coming. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end here about the partnership between Dataiku and Databricks. We've done there's a lot of content out there about how the two platforms and companies work together. So we're not going to spend a ton of time on that, but we want to make sure for people who aren't familiar at all, that we'll at least give you a little bit of the basics. But that definitely won't be the focus of it. We want to talk especially around the data, the survey, the results, what does this tell us about here going forward? So let's dive into the data, and I will hand it off to Oliver to take point on this first section here.
Thanks, Connor. Unsurprisingly, as before we even get to the survey, there's a major spoiler alert, and that spoiler is that GenAI, in fact, is changing everything. I think a lot of us here are very well aware of that since GenAI has been around for now, 12, 18 months. And we're really seeing this across, not just as surveys. It's like we're hearing this from customers, we're hearing it from analysts. And really the potential that people are really excited about as it relates to GenAI is how it could dramatically improve things like employee productivity. It might potentially give those organizations who are really well invested in GenAI a significant competitive advantage. We're starting to really see that play out amongst our customer base. So just really interesting as we dive into the survey that it really does potentially have the potential to change everything. So let's go into the next slide. So this slide, if you look at the kind of the thrust of it, is around organizational spend. So organizations who are going to spend on GenAI, and as Connor mentioned, this survey has been run for 2 years straight. This specific slide, the data that we have is only for the last year. So we have 1 year's worth of data. But this is what we're seeing over the past year. And in fact, if you were to add up all those bars that indicate there's at least plans for some sort of spend for GenAI, it adds up to 84%. And that, I would argue, is a very significant number and is a very good indicator that organizations are going to be spending something on GenAI. But I think even more significant, if you are just to add up those organizations who are planning to spend 200,000 or above, we get to 81%. It's not that much different. And so think about that. 81% of organizations are going to spend $200,000 or more on GenAI. That's really an amazing stat. And it really speaks to, the potential that we talked about just in that previous slide, that organizations are really excited about the potential of GenAI. It really could be something world-changing, and organizations are willing to spend to really figure out how GenAI and the potential can play out within their specific company, their use cases, their industries, their verticals. Okay, great. Let's go to the next slide. So of those surveyed, 33% have a dedicated budget for GenAI in the next 12 months. And that's really huge, right? That's really huge. If you think about that, that really means that 1/3 of organizations have a dedicated line item for GenAI. On their budget, it actually has a GenAI label that they're allocating for GenAI specifically. Now, I mean, let's just say that this is an amazing stat considering 2 years ago, GenAI didn't even exist, or it wasn't a top of mind topic amongst our business or technical leaders, right? And now 1/3 of organizations have a dedicated budget. And in fact, as I was just thinking about this survey that we ran together, I've also seen other surveys that are even more optimistic. It's pretty crazy, right? And so I was just recalling that I was reading a Gartner survey recently that said that half of business leaders have actually allocated a portion of their budget to GenAI. Half of business leaders, 50%. And so this really is a trend that I think is only going to go up as we move forward from here. We're seeing anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of organizations having some sort of dedicated line item to GenAI. And in fact, probably many more organizations actually do have budget for GenAI maybe it's not dedicated as part of a bigger project that they're doing within their IT organization. So it's just really, really exciting as we see organizations really focus on GenAI. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so where are the use cases? And I think that's a very common question as it relates to GenAI, is we all understand the potential, at least intrinsically, or I think especially as people, everyone really has been able to experience using chatbots, specifically ChatGPT. So everyone could kind of visualize, wow, this could be game changing. But where are the use cases? Where are they being deployed? And so this question really answers that. And as you can see, across many lines of businesses, and they all have real use cases. And so IT is an obvious one. It's number one, and I think that is very clear. But we've seen, I think across Dataiku and Databricks, that customers are starting to deploy real use cases across horizontal departments and across vertical industries as well. So in fact, at Databricks, and when we partner heavily with Dataiku on this, is we're seeing customers deploying GenAI, and across the major verticals, right? Financial services, healthcare, life sciences, communications, media, and entertainment, consumer goods and retail, manufacturing, public sector. Across all of these verticals, we're seeing kind of real use cases being deployed. In fact, so much so that we're starting to catalog, what are the top 3 use cases by vertical. And so especially as you all customers are implementing GenAI for the first time, it's something to really think about and to partner with Dataiku and Databricks because of our experiences in implementing these real use cases amongst our customers. We're starting to see, for example, like in financial services, you have use cases like risk and compliance or fraud prevention or customer experiences. Or in healthcare and life sciences, you might have use cases around provider performance or streamlining operations or improving patient care or patient 360. So these are the types of use cases that AI and GenAI is starting to play a real impact in. And so the summary is if you are starting to experiment with GenAI, a lot of organizations start with a chatbot, right? And that's the first thing that they do. But really AI projects are becoming much more than that. And companies are really identifying real business use cases that have material impact, huge ROI, huge value that they're starting to deploy or thinking about deploying, starting to deploy PLCs and proof of concepts and putting those things starting into production. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is an interesting slide, and it's really kind of communicating a lot of fears, and you kind of contrast the fear versus optimism, right? So if you look at the left-hand side, you see that there's actually 4 quadrants of potential answers between risk and opportunity. And if you look at straight down the middle, there's kind of an even split between the answers of somewhat or totally justified to somewhat or totally overblown as it relates to risk and potential value. And so the interesting, the interesting dynamic between last year and this and 2 years ago, over this past year, and I guess a couple years ago, or a couple of times we did the survey, is that if you look at the far left and the far right of both last year and this year, that's really where a lot of the material change happened. And so you'll see that organizations who are a lot more concerned about the risks or was very, very optimistic about the future of AI, those numbers have both gone down over the last 2 years. And so we're really getting to the point where organizations are being a lot more understanding of the potential risks, and they're not as worried as they were before. But they're also not overly, completely, positively optimistic, like overblown of its potential either. And so we're getting to the point where organizations are starting to really understand both the risk and the benefits of AI a lot better. And I think that's a much healthier place to be. So if you look at the right-hand side, this is really around the leaders specifically and how they understand the benefits of AI and also the risks. And as you can see, we're definitely trending towards understanding the benefits a lot more. But really, the summary I would say about this slide is people are less worried. They understand the risks a lot better, right? Especially like and we'll probably talk about this in the next section, around security, governance, all those types of things that people are concerned about. But they also understand the opportunity a lot more because they're starting to put real use cases into action. So they're not thinking that this is going to solve world hunger or anything, but it could have some material impact. And so people are so excited. And so I would say that's the summary of this slide. The needle is moving, and I think it's moving to a much healthier place. Okay, and so with that, I'm going to hand over the next section to Conor.
Awesome. Thank you, Oliver. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and especially that last point that you make around, like, it's not that we've moved from, the naysayers have now all become like super, super excited about it, right? Like it feels like the conversation is more nuanced, which feels better, right? Like that means it's more real. People are digging in because yes, there's a ton of potential here and we're seeing ROI, but obviously as the sort of slide says, hey, like we did this survey before, sort of right at the dawn of the GenAI wave. And unsurprisingly, with GenAI, as we've seen with other waves of, ML and data science and other things like that, there's some trends that seem to be repeating themselves. So, and I saw a couple of comments in the chat here that I think that speak right to this, is that one of the things that I find really, really interesting is that, we're seeing very focused spend on this, but the estimated return on it isn't there yet, right? And this is where companies are, looking at it. I actually think it's really interesting that the first bucket of like, they can't discuss it grew a lot, because my hypothesis there, always, you never sort of know, is that it's because tracking ROI for data products in general can be tricky. And for GenAI especially, this has been really challenging, right? And so I think there's a lot of challenge right now in identifying those right use cases, bringing these tools to bear because they are so new. There's a lot of technological hurdles to understand to sort of make sure that you actually have it implemented, security, all of those sorts of things. We'll talk about some of the challenges people are having. But at the end of the day, we see, really there are, of course, still some companies, some organizations, some use cases out there that are getting a 10x return on their investments on AI. However, like that proportion of people that are getting a ton isn't growing, right? If we even normalize for the people that are in that first bucket of the cannot discuss, we really see pretty similar proportions from year one to year two in terms of how much people are getting out of their investments here. And I think that it is a lot of potential, but people aren't necessarily getting what they're putting in yet, and they're not seeing those huge potential returns. And we see almost 10% are showing a negative return, right? They are at this point in time getting back less than they are putting in. And over 10% are really sort of neutral to negative. So there's clearly some work there, but why are we seeing these sort of challenges for people to get it? Or more to the point, like why hasn't it, it suddenly tipped over yet? So there's a number of barriers that we see for people trying to get value out of these. And, if you look at sort of the rankings, you can see there's a little bit of shift from year one to year two and year one to year two in terms of like number 1, 2, 3, 4, but like the proportions are pretty similar. We don't see huge shifts there. And look, if you've been working in data for any length of time, none of these are going to be surprising to you, right? Like these are the same challenges that we've been having in the data space from, the days of BI and reporting, to the days of data science and machine learning, to the days of AI now, right? Like here, it can be hard to quickly operationalize stuff, right? You find a potential challenge or you find something that you can solve with it. Like how quickly can you actually get the right data, bring the right tool to bear, and then get that actually like out and in production, right? Via sort of your ML ops or LLM ops pipelines. Lack of good data. Unsurprisingly, that actually now becomes more of a problem, right? More data, more people using the data, more people working with new and different tools, that, those access barriers, the good data or just access to data period continues to challenge. The lack of data talent or data literate workforce is a really, sticky one that we've been working towards for a long time. The pool of people who know and can work with these tools is growing, but it is definitely not growing faster than the demand for those people with those skills. lack of visibility and control, governance, and this can be in, hey, how do I make sure that my data is not being exposed externally? How do I make sure that it's not being exposed internally inappropriately, right? Like not everybody at your company should be able to see all the same data. Infrastructure that is too complex. Actually, I think that this is an interesting one that it actually went down because obviously with the sort of stack of tools around using these Gen AI, like there are new things that people are having to be put into place, but it is actually not been as big a lift as a lot of the sort of previous waves of technology. I think that the infrastructure available via the clouds and the fact that, of course, many of these tools are being generated via API rather than having to manage the whole infrastructure yourself to get started. Obviously, people are doing a lot of hybrid infrastructure and managing pieces themselves, but that's an exciting side to me. It sort of feels like obviously working on the infrastructure side of the world, like that we're doing some things right and at least making these tools easier for companies to work with. And then the last couple, lack of a clear business case. This is again, I think it goes back to the slide that Oliver showed earlier. Like that actually is improving. People are going deeper and deeper into some of the things that they're working on, and they're looking further and wider across the different applications of their enterprise. But cost is a big one, especially with the sort of scaling nature where that AI can be, it's more expensive to use than to build, which is a different shift for us. So a lot of these things should feel really familiar, and they're things that we really have been working towards for a long time, and hopefully we continue to sort of make improvement on them. But it's just not surprising to see that sort of within the bounds of statistical error, we don't see a whole lot of shift in terms of where these things went to from last year to this year. Specifically, if we look at the generative AI side, though, here's where we sort of see the specific, we asked specifically around that topic. So like, why are there challenges? Huge amount of people saying that they don't have the accesses to the resources internally or externally to actually run them. This is, I think, strikes right at the heart of, it's not at this point in time necessarily a technological barrier. There are governance, data access issues, restrictions and things like that. That's where people are really trying to work through it, that it feels like there's a lot to unpack for companies to make sure that they're giving access to the tools. And I think that, one of the comments in the chat sort of talked about a lot of the initial spend has been really towards infrastructure or, co-pilot type, just additive things to things you're already doing. Those aren't the advanced ones. Those aren't the, real opportunities there. And companies, while the technological barrier may not be there, there's still a lot of barriers to being able to get the right or getting these tools into a wider hand of the people at their companies. Some of that may come from the second one of our employees don't know what to do with it. That is a skill question and a challenge. And then, I think is a little bit of a, catch-22 of we're not giving these out widely to everybody because we don't believe everybody knows what to do with it. But then the people who think they know what to do with it can't get access to it because they can't necessarily articulate how they're going to use it yet. So there's a little bit of a loop there that we need to start to help to upskill all the people. Some of it can just be explicit internal policies. So not even necessarily like external governance or things like that. There's a lot of valid data security, cybersecurity questions that are in place here that, for IT organizations, especially IT organizations with cybersecurity who face data breaches or other challenges like that, there's a lot that they are sort of facing to make sure that they are rolling these things out safely. Again, on the one hand, it feels like we've been working with these tools now for quite a while, but time span of 18 to 24 months, right? The sort of Chat GPT really only dropped just shy of 2 years ago. That's a pretty short time frame, honestly, for the sea change that has happened into IT organizations trying to manage these things. And so, if you're a big company and you're in IT there managing infrastructure for thousands, tens of thousands of people, that's a lot to sort of unpack. So it's a real challenge. The other, we saw a few different things, but the most dominant one there that we didn't have explicit sort of response for was really around government governance and regulations, right? And I think we see that a little bit more in the EU with the EU AI Act, but certainly there was the White House memorandum. There's a lot of challenges, coming challenges on working with these things. And so people are trying to figure that out. But that's some of those core barriers. But, look, is there anything on here that people haven't already heard or is done before, right? Lack of access to resources to run a machine learning model or a data science model. People don't know how to use machine learning. We have internal policies preventing it, right? Like these are the same challenges that we've been wrestling with in the data space for a long time. A few other highlights that didn't change, right? The presence of data leaders in the C-suite, we certainly see for some of those companies that are tracking ROI higher, they're more likely to have a data leader in the C-suite, but we still don't see that growing in prevalence. There's articles out there about chief AI officers or changing nature of chief data officers, but it's not sort of been institutionalized in many new places yet, even given the amount of changes happening. Companies that are trying to upskill internally and offer company-wide AI or data education, has stayed about the same, just a little over half. Making trusted data easily accessible to people, that hasn't grown either, right? So a little less than half of our respondents say that that's a priority for them as a company. And then having the right infrastructure in place to support AI efforts for the next few years, really still, again, only about half of respondents. And so, some of these are markers that we look for that we tend to see in the companies that are showing a higher ROI, and it doesn't really seem to be moving as much as we'd like to see, or we'd expect to see in those companies trying to, improve how they're actually like benefiting from and getting the ROI out of these tools. The last one on the organizational spend, right? We talked about upfront with Oliver talking about sort of the trend from year to year of how much people are willing to spend. We split out in the report between AI pioneers and AI laggards, and there's a few sort of specific markers that we have in there to identify people as pioneers. But what we see, unsurprisingly, is that the AI pioneers are spending more, right? And so it sort of feels a little bit like begging the question, like, of course, people who are farther ahead are spending more money and investing more. But surprisingly, what I thought was really interesting was last year when you did this survey, you did see a shift where the people who were spending more, the pioneers, also were tracking a higher ROI, relatively speaking. This year, we actually don't see as much of that difference, right? And so some of that can, of course, just be, a sample size of 400 is not humongous, but it's sizable enough to obviously draw some conclusions. But even for companies that were pioneers and have been investing and building a lot in this data space already, even those companies are having to work at it, and in some cases struggling with the shift to working with AI and generative AI. Just because they're already making ROI out of their data investments doesn't automatically mean that they're getting the returns on their generative AI investments. And I think that that's really interesting and speaks to, it's a different, right? Was the spoiler alert at the beginning, generative AI changed everything. It really is changing things, even for organizations that are already pretty data savvy. It also shows that there's a lot of opportunity, right? Like Oliver talked about the potential that people are seeing and they're spending and they're investing. Some of the challenges are the same as we've seen from the data world, but there is opportunity for companies. You don't have to already be ahead to successfully leverage GenAI. Some companies are playing catch up pretty successfully. All right, so what? So we've seen, the last 12 months has had certainly some shifts in, and generative AI has made a difference in how companies are thinking about and investing and a broader set of use cases. But many of those still same challenges are there. So how do we actually move forward? And how do you make, advantage? How do you actually succeed in doing some of these things? So the handful of things, and of course, Oliver, feel free to chime in here and we'll talk a little bit about the partnership too as well. But some of the basics, right? These are things which we know. They are rarely the sexy parts of talking about it, right? Talking about which model you're using has always been fun as a data scientist. Talking about, what infrastructure you're landing on, talking about what LLMs you're using, all of those, those are they can be big and splashy and they're easy to talk about, but data quality, governance, connections, stable infrastructures, making it widely available to people across your organization, both the data and the tools, these aren't new. They're not different in the Gen AI world. or they're not different requirements, right? Like we still need to make sure that we have good data, that people can get to it, that we know who's using what data. These actually arguably become more important now because we have more people using new and more challenging tools, especially when you start thinking about the sort of like non-deterministic nature of GenAI and, not having the same input output every time. The challenge for actually having good data quality, things like now prompt engineering come into play. And then of course there's, things like guarding against prompt injection or sort of data poisoning so like all of these build on top of these basics. But if you don't have good data to begin with, you're not going to have good data going into the AI, of course, right? I'm telling everybody things they already know. So, right, the basics, like these are still important. There are nuances in how they apply to generative AI, but they are still the things that, we've been kind of pounding the drum from the data community for years and years, and they're still important.
Yeah, and then one thing I
go ahead,
Connor, is like I think for sure those of us who have been in the data science space, for a good number of years, we all kind of get it, right? We understand. Okay, yeah, data is absolutely needed for my models. And we need to make sure that the data is clean, all that kind of stuff. But I think as organizations start to play with GenAI, there is maybe some thought around, they might not be thinking about these things, right? They're thinking, oh, maybe I could just deploy an LLM, and that LLM can just figure out and work on my data. It's intelligent or sentient or something like that. I've seen ChatGPT. It works very well. Maybe they do a proof of concept with a simple RAG solution or something like that, and in the PLC is like, oh well, look, I can pretty easily connect my data up to these foundation models and do some amazing things. But what we've really seen is as companies start to move those POCs and experiments into production, kind of to what you're saying in terms of the existing challenges, like everything that they thought was possible actually is a lot harder than they think because of the non-deterministic part of the LLM.
Yeah.
And really accuracy, safety, and governance is and the things that you're showing here around just making sure data quality and security and governance and all that kind of stuff, super important as it relates to GenAI, and something that organizations are starting to realize that is extremely important as you deploy GenAI into production, of getting quality data, accuracy of the LLM, understanding your domain and your data, and just your company's data a lot better, are all very important aspects of a GenAI production deployment.
Absolutely. No, I think that and not to go sort of too deep, right? Because I think it's, we've got a lot of topics here, but I think one of the things that's really an interesting challenge in the basics here is that, historically when we're thinking about building and training models sort of ourselves using scikit-learn and data or, something along those lines to do some machine learning, there's a lot of effort and investment in sort of training and building the model. Well, the foundation models, they're not that, right? Like, sure, we can fine tune them, and there's, certainly organizations out there who are building or fine tuning their own LLMs, but for the most part, take your data and hook it up to the LLM and you can start to do things. But then that's shifting the effort to sort of like validating responses, validating data. And so like the effort is still there and it still requires all these basics to be in place. And so I totally agree with you right there, Oliver. So yeah, it's nuanced and there's differences and there's new challenges, but at the end of the day, we're still wrestling with a lot of the same areas that we've had to work on for a long time. Back to the comments around ROI, right? I guess the sort of combination of the first part of people are spending, and I think it is super important to again reinforce that sort of a third of the respondents so they have a dedicated budget for GenAI. I've been working in the sort of data world and tech now on either side, because I was actually in industry building a data science platform, and then sort of before coming over to tech. So the last 15 years I've been a part of that, and watching, the growth of companies that sort of actually have like a line item, a dedicated budget for a data science platform or, data governance tools or things like that. Like that's a very slow creep, and I'd be surprised if still, even at this point in time, in terms of sort of like, core data platforms, an actual data science or data machine learning development platform if much more than half of companies have a dedicated budget there. So to see a dedicated budget of a third of companies already for a technology that's less than 2 years old is unprecedented in my experience. But here's where the challenge comes, is that like less than a third of companies, just over a fourth, have like a real framework for calculating and accounting for ROI that they're using for these things. And so like that's, if you're on the finance team, or more to the point, you're in the data world, in the data team, and making sure that you're justifying your budget and these tools that you're buying and these LLMs you're spending on and the people you're hiring, the bills come due, right? Like CFOs and boards like to understand what they're writing checks for. And so this is where you start to like sometimes get a little bit nervous of like, okay, we've got a lot of companies spending money on this who haven't even put in place yet the ability to validate that they've made that spend appropriate. And we should be thinking about that like real hard. And we, Dataiku, Databricks, both of us have teams that do value engineering that will work with our customers to help them put these frameworks in place, because we certainly understand the necessity of being able to sort of like articulate that you're getting what you're spending on. And this is, I think, a paramount challenge for companies in the near future, because there's a lot of spend, huge amounts of investment, a third to a half at least, making dedicated budgets, and companies there, that we saw are spending more than $10 million a year or planning to on this. And, that spigot will turn off real fast if you can't come back 6, 10, 12, 24 months later and show the value that you got out of that. So this is something I do think is where companies really need to be thinking, and the data leaders need to put a lot of focus into. The other side here is, and it's an interesting sort of counterpoint of the, like, yes, do the basics, but also we need to be able to move faster. And this is where I'm excited about that result, that again, not a huge shift, but just that like technological constraints seem to be, coming down a little bit. And I think that, as we move more and more into the world of cloud, infrastructure as a service, LLMs as a service, right? So, these things make it faster, or able for us to move faster. But the challenge there is then the back end of, how do we do this safely? How are we tracking the ROI? How do we have the security pieces in place? The Dataiku solution for that, we call the LLM mesh. And it's really having single gateways where you can track things. It's having places where you can sort of track all of your users and do things from a governance perspective. Also from a cost perspective, be able to see what LLMs, what project you're using, all of that sort of stuff. Manage security and permissions in as few places as possible. And I think that, at the end of the day, this sort of comes back to, what I've sort of had as a mantra around building platforms for data use in general, is there's a lot of components here and there's a lot of moving pieces. And as GenAI has sort of only exploded that further, but you really need to think about having sort of the fewest tools that are serving the most people as possible, because that's how you're able to govern it. That's how you're able to keep things secure, but then sort of like put guardrails around that then allow people to move faster, rather than having to manage every use case, every person, every data set. You have to put the right policies in place and use the right tools that allow you to move faster and go farther. And it's an interesting, like, if you do the basics, sometimes that's a little bit more work up front, but that's what allows you to move faster at the back end. I don't know if you have any thoughts there, Oliver, and I'll go into the next one.
No, I would completely echo with you on this. I think this is an extremely, I can't overemphasize, this is an extremely important part of your GenAI architecture that you have to get correct. And it's really around this concept of, easy to get into a POC with an LLM that, in a simple RAG scenario, very hard to make sure you have that PII detection and content moderation, right? Very hard to make sure that the LLM is not outputting something that it shouldn't be outputting from a security perspective. And so like these are the key components that are needed if you want to put your GenAI application into production. You can't just, you can't just turn on ChatGPT or GPT-4 in a simple, RAG with your enterprise data. You have to really make sure that this security, governance, compliance, and just like all these things are in place, so that people really trust what they're saying, really. And so, yeah, I think this is an extremely important part that as people start to put their GenAI solutions into production, that they really need to think about this.
Absolutely. No, appreciate that. All right. So real quick, as I said at the upfront, we'll give a tiny bit about the partnership between Dataiku and Databricks, and then I see a few questions in the Q&A. We'll dive into those, and then please, as others come up, please feel free to throw more in there. But so real quick, just to give just a quick sort of highlights of how Dataiku and Databricks work together. So you can think of Databricks very strongly as like a super powerful, like both storage and compute solution that allows your, most sophisticated users to do all sorts of, amazing things with data, and then bring in things like, the LLMs, other machine learning, things like that. And so you can think about, this is a Dataiku flow. For those who have never sort of seen it before, we put a UI on top of Databricks that allows not just your most sophisticated users to use it, but really everybody in your organization can then also have sort of access to the amazing power that the Databricks brings. And so, if you sort of think about, sort of linear flow from accessing data, cleaning up and preparing it for, you pull your data into Databricks that, puts it in the, Delta Lake format, allows you to sort of start to move things quickly. You can have some people who are writing code, writing SQL, using the Databricks connector and, pushing down, or writing, some Python or something if they need to do something esoteric or doing, but a lot of that data preps can happen, obviously, sort of in SQL. But you also have users that are going to just do things via visual recipes. They don't know SQL, they don't know how to code, but, for the types of things that they would normally throw in Excel, they can do that now with, the power and the something, like Databricks behind them. And so pulling all that data together, structuring it, and then being able to say, okay, now I've got some data. I can do some reports. I can run some machine learning. I can apply an LLM or something like that. That's where then again, you have different ways to be able to do that. You have people who can write, Python, PySpark, to build and train those models to do all that themselves. Or you have auto machine learning capabilities where, you're sort of less tech savvy users can also work through and build some of those components with it. All of this then, though, is fully sort of two-way compatible within Unity Catalog. Everything that people are building and registering and training, both from a model and a data perspective, all stays within Databricks. Dataiku doesn't pull anything out. It all stays in Databricks. It's reflected in Unity Catalog. Everything is sort of, very clear and easy to see how people are using that data. And you have, the ability for, again, all the people at your organization to have access to the sort of investments that you've made in that infrastructure of Databricks by putting Dataiku on top of it. And then, of course, conversely, like if you're Dataiku users, there's a lot of potential out there for different infrastructures. You can use native cloud capabilities, you can use things on-prem and whatever. And, our partnership with Databricks means that in terms of an infrastructure that works really seamlessly with Dataiku, you're able to move so much more quickly and can be sort of quite affordable, as you're intelligent in how you're doing it. And so, there's a lot of two-way compatibility in terms of, Databricks really provides that data layer for both storage and compute. Dataiku helps put a, very powerful UI on top of that. What we see in terms of the people working with this, we see customers move, they are able to access more data and build more projects. We sort of see things moving more quickly. We also then have pre-built capabilities that people can use between the two. There's a lot of seamless collaboration, especially as you get out sort of your just core data users, your data scientists, your data engineers, et cetera. You need to get more people into and working with the data rather than data going out into desktop tools, out into reports, and out, sort of in the world. You want to keep that, closer to and manage. And so Dataiku plus Databricks really allows for that seamless collaboration from your like hardcore users working in Databricks and your business users who are, working in Dataiku on top of Databricks to work with all the same data and tools. And then we really see, we talked a little bit early on, Oliver, around the sort of production side of things, and how that inability to put things into production quickly can really harm your investments. And this is where, between MLflow and the other sort of MLOps capabilities of Databricks and then Dataiku's governance on top of that, can help people move faster through that production lifecycle as well. So to give just sort of a quick, I don't want to go much more into that. The link is in the chat in case you haven't already seen it. Here, I'll leave this up for a minute, and then we'll actually go to some questions because I'll give people time to sort of pull out and they want to do it. feel free to go ahead and please go and download the report. It's really interesting. Goes through and gives much more sort of in-depth findings in some of the things that you saw there. And if you have any questions, or of course, you're always welcome to reach out to Oliver or myself to go deeper on some of those responses. But let me turn it over to Renata now, and we'll go through hopefully some questions that have come through.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Connor and Oliver, for sharing such valuable insights on the AI and GenAI landscape today. Since we have about 14 minutes left, we'll open up the floor for questions. As a quick reminder, you can submit your questions in the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll aim to address as many as possible in the time we have left. So starting with the first question, someone in the audience asked, the lack of quality data as a barrier has increased in 2024 relative to 2023. In your opinion, what are the 2 to 3 driving factors for it, and what may organizations need to do to reverse that trend?
Oliver, why don't you take first stab at that, and I'll follow on.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of shooting off the cuff. My guess, and this is just a hypothesis, in terms of data quality, it could just be very well something that we've experienced for the last decade, which is that there's just more data being produced. And so as more data is being produced, likely the quality of such data has been impacted. That would be my guess for as it relates to between last year and this year. Although I don't know if there was a major kind of a major point in time where actually like the size of data has dramatically changed between last year and this year. But that's just a guess. Connor, what do you think? And you're on mute.
Of course I'm on mute. See? All right. I should just never mute myself. That's the answer here. No. I think certainly like the pace of data growing is a big part of it. One of the things that I think is an interesting shift in that last year is, one of the potentials of generative AI is obviously to work with our unstructured data more easily than we have in the past, right? And, keeping structured data, your data warehouses, your data lakes, all your sort of SQL type data, like that's already a challenge from a data quality perspective. But once you start throwing in, and here's this giant repository of PDFs, now we're dealing with and we've been working with unstructured data before, but again, the scale of now what's coming in, I think that's one of the big changes is just that how much more unstructured data people are working with now. And I think then that couples with, and this is where I'm not sure, and if people are sort of conflating the challenge of working with the data quality of results from models versus what's going into models, right? Because that's, I think, the other thing is that, and there's hallucinations being sort of like the typical response or the typical sort of shorthand for it. But I think as we work now with the non-deterministic generative AI models, where I don't know that it's maybe data quality. I think data quality is still a challenge, but I think that it's now people are being exposed to the sort of uncertainty inherent in working with statistical and probabilistic models in a way that they haven't before. And so, if you say, and so again, it's a hypothesis. It's something that I certainly see, but I don't know if that's what's actually driving the answer. But it's, are people conflating the unpredictable nature and sometimes that of the response that is like just more apparent than it was when it was numerical responses or other recommendation engines or other things like that, where you weren't sort of quite as susceptible to that the quality of your response was not good.
Yeah, actually, now that you said that I think that probably does ring true. Is like, we've been struggling with data quality for over a decade, right?
Forever.
And like remember, like it wasn't that long ago that we were in the big data trend, where it was all about data, volume, the 3 V's of volume, velocity, and just variety data.
Yeah.
So it's like we've been struggling with this for quite some time, and the quality has always been something that specific Databricks has been really looking into solving and has been for many years. And so, but I think between last year and this year, you're right? Like it's the Gen AI trend where maybe it's less about quality and it's more about the output and the perception that because the output is hallucinating, that there's a bigger data quality problem than there already was, might be accentuating that. And so I think that could be, you could be onto something on that one.
I think that's possible. Awesome. All right, Renato, you just throw another one at us.
All right, thank you for both your responses. Moving on to the next question. I was reading the report and saw that 65% of respondents with GenAI use cases in production are seeing ROI on those use cases. Would love to hear if Conor and Oliver are surprised by that or feel like that's pretty spot on.
As an off the cuff for me, sort of like roughly about 2/3 of use cases seeing positive ROI. I think that I guess I'm not surprised by it. I would maybe even have assumed it to be a little bit lower, just because a lot of Gen AI stuff so far is still nascent in the sort of actually hitting production, right? That was, I'd say that was the tale of certainly of last year, was that it was, and everybody was experimenting and building prototypes or POCs, but so few people were putting things into production. And this year, especially when you go to the conferences, the Data and AI and the Databricks event earlier this year, at the Everyday AI events, like the conversation around LLM ops and pushing things into production, it definitely is way more prevalent this year than it was last year. And there's a lot more now real conversations about people putting things into production and actually sort of seeing how they're going. And so, I wonder if it's just that, like, there's enough people out there now really trying to do it. I also think that maybe that's higher than I would have guessed, just because people have been slow to put things to production, right? So, like, that's I guess, I still don't think that most, I'd say less than a quarter of companies that I talk to on a regular basis actually have Gen AI stuff into production. And so that's, I think, maybe that is then, for those that have crossed that threshold, the fact that they're seeing value is really promising. And the fact that, nearly 2/3 of them are seeing the value makes sense. So yeah, I think it does. I've talked to myself in circles. Yes, I do think it makes sense. But yeah, I think that would be the proportion of people that are seeing the ROI is still pretty low, but I think it's that combination of how many people actually made it to production and are tracking it to see that positive ROI. The people that are that sophisticated, the fact that they're seeing ROI, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you talked yourself into the right to the answer I was thinking about, Conor, which is like, I still and I think both Dataiku and Databricks were on the same page. Like when we talk to our customers, the majority of customers are trying GenAI. That's for certain, without a doubt. The amount of customers that actually have a production deployment at scale, very few. Definitely not 65% of organizations, but of the organizations who actually have done that. And so they've already gone through all the typical hurdles that you would see as you put something to production, as we mentioned before, around, data quality, security, governance, just be able to do it at scale at a cost-effective place. And for them to reach ROI of 65%, it would make a lot of sense for those who actually have done that, because they have gone through all the typical challenges that most companies haven't been able to implement just yet, which is they have the model, it's out there. They have all the right protocols around governance, security. They know how to evaluate accuracy of the LLM. And so they're in a really good place at this point. For them to start seeing ROI makes a lot of sense because, again, the potential of GenAI is significant, but there are significant amount of hurdles for companies to be able to adopt that. And so, yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I think it'll grow, right? I think we're still early days, relatively speaking.
Yeah, awesome. So next question. In the previous waves of digital transformation, there was a lot of demand to add value to align people's mindsets, behaviors, and skill sets. I am not seeing the same demand for practitioners like myself as change and enablement strategists. Is that your experience?
Interesting. Do you have an immediate thought to that all?
Okay, so digital transformation in terms of changing people's mindsets. Yeah, I mean, I think in general, there's always a like. Let's play this out before GenAI, right? There's always like, okay, if we were to take a data driven mindset, which was kind of the trend, 5-10 years ago, probably more 5 years ago, there was I think what Lori might be mentioning is, well, if you want to become a data driven organization, you need to change the entire culture of the organization to really think about making decisions based on data, not just based on gut feel, right? So I think that was the big kind of cultural shift that was happening with those major trends just not too long ago. And so I think what Lori's probably asking is, as it relates to GenAI, is there supposed to be a cultural change in terms of the practitioners and the users and the executives around GenAI? And even for her as a practitioner, is there do they have to do something to enable the organization to do that shift in change?
Yeah.
I don't know if what you've seen, Connor, but I think the interesting thing about GenAI specifically is that almost every user has used GenAI, which is very different than in the trends of using data and BI and analytics and that kind of stuff. Because not everyone has written their own report. They usually go to IT, they get a report written, all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
With GenAI, everyone has tried Chat GPT at least once or twice, and many are starting to use it on a daily basis. And so I think that whole Chat GPT moment, which is what they've been saying in the news and all that kind of stuff, has really already started to shift people to understanding the benefits of using GenAI practically within the organization. But I think there will be a cultural shift, which is that, okay, I know how to use this for my day-to-day stuff, right? I know how to use it to ask and prompt it and all that kind of stuff. But like, what is a cultural shift for using it within my business context? Like, what's possible? What can I use it for? How can I really ramp my productivity for my specific use cases, and not just be like a chatbot type use case, but something that really increases my productivity? I think that there is still a cultural shift for that, and it could be different by department and by the potential use cases within a sales and marketing could be a lot different than within your engineering department. And I think that kind of mind shift still has to happen, I think.
Yeah, I think that sort of the commercial usage was there first, right? In a way that I think when we think about other big digital transformations, like the move to the cloud 15 years ago, right? Like nobody was at home using the cloud all the time, coming to work going like, let's use the cloud, right? Like IT was coming out and saying we're going to shift to AWS, and everybody goes like, the heck is AWS, right? So like I do think that's I think you're right spot on there, is that like people have been exposed to this in a way that I think is far more widespread than any other sort of digital transformation type thing. You have there's nerds like us that like to hang around and play with numbers, and so when BI and stuff like that and cool tools were coming there, we were really excited, but that wasn't the wider group of people. And so I do think that this one, and in sort of, I was trying to think of examples of where I have seen companies have, and because a lot of companies do have a head of GenAI, or I was just with a customer a couple of weeks ago that had somebody who was their like Google Cloud champion, but is now their GenAI champion. So I think that like people are doing that. But what's interesting is that a lot of those people aren't coming from the data practitioner side. They're coming from the business side and being tasked to do that, right? One customer I have was someone from HR that was sort of in their like future of work type work stream project stuff. That's who's now like the champion, pushing GenAI and things like that. So it's not, and so maybe it's because there's much more accessibility of people that are in the business that sort of can be the champions for that doesn't require taking the technical people out of working on the tech, and maybe we'll like finally solve this like AI transformation translator architect, whatever. I've heard so many different titles for it, and we've never sort of figured that role out. Like maybe because we needed more people coming from the business side rather than from the tech side, and that's actually happening here like organically in a way that we've never been able to make happen. So yeah, I like that thought, Oliver.
Awesome. Thanks both. Unfortunately, we are just about out of time. Connor and Oliver, do you have time for one more question or?
Yeah, for sure. I see
Yes,
that
so last
interesting. Yeah,
question.
shoot.
We pulled this from the comment section, but one person in the audience asked, looking into your crystal ball, which class of company will benefit from GenAI the most, and will it give them a competitive advantage to dominate in their markets? For example, will enterprise companies benefit more than SMBs or mid-market or converse?
Yeah. It's really interesting. What I would say, and especially because of some of the stuff we talked about in the survey responses around, now granted, recognizing that the survey response is biased towards the enterprise side, but the thing that I think is really interesting to pull on a couple threads we talked about. One that we were just talking about is that this is a tool, or Gen AI broadly is a tool that is much more accessible to a wider variety of people at your organization. Coupling that with that, it's a little bit of a lower technological hurdle to get started using this, right? You don't need to build a freaking Hadoop cluster to, start working with this, right? Like the technology here is so much more accessible than it used to be. The nuance and the people, I'm actually really interested. It may be that smaller and mid-sized businesses will be able to move faster, because I think that the barriers to entry into this, which a lot of times historically have been big investments in technology, big investments in teams of data scientists, everything like that. Those are, I don't want to say that that's not necessary. You still need data scientists and technology and all that sort of stuff. But I think that those things are becoming more accessible, and more people are trying to get into this. And there's more sort of interest and knowledge coming from the sort of business side that, if you're a smaller company, relatively smaller company, your ability to move on that can be a lot faster, right? Like big companies are hard to shift. There's a lot of, it's moving a battleship versus, a speedboat or whatever, right? And so I would say that the Gen AI stuff will maybe bias a potential advantage to smaller companies to be able to move faster on taking advantage of this. There's still a lot of precursors. We still need to master the basics. They have the data, but that's one area that I think is interesting. The second one, and I think that this is where the more intuition a company, or closer to its customers a company is, I think that there's so much potential in Gen AI for customer interaction, customer relations, customer understanding, things like that, the companies that I've seen move faster so far with this tend to be companies that have sort of made being customer centric, or at least know their customers already a priority. That's one, I think, an interesting, I'm glad you asked this question, because it wasn't something I really thought about before, but it's that I think is one that companies that have made that investment, Gen AI is really particularly suited to sort of improving customer understanding, improving customer communications, things like that, people who've invested in that may have an advantage going forward. So that's the couple thoughts. It's a good question though. So thanks for asking it, whoever put it there.
Yeah, and well, we're short in time. I would agree with you, Connor. I think in general, what we've seen definitely is the smaller organizations, startups, digital natives. They're actually really embracing Gen AI significantly, and they're oftentimes doing the most advanced Gen AI techniques right now. They're we've seen a lot of adoption of pre-training their own custom LLMs, not even using run standard out of the box LLMs, and so. We're definitely seeing that trend with the kind of digital native startups, smaller organizations who are basically going all in. They're betting on Gen AI, and with some pretty amazing results. But what I would say is generally, I think the organization that will win is the organization that is able to connect Gen AI with their enterprise data in a meaningful way. So as long as they're able to figure this out, where they're really securely connecting these foundation models with their enterprise data and able to make some material changes to their business model or use cases or interaction with customers or just internal productivity, we're going to see those organizations leapfrog their competitors, no matter if they're big or small. It's just as long as they got the buy-off and the buy-in from an organization perspective that they're going to go, make significant investments in this space. I think really it's that connection between GenAI and one's enterprise data, their unique IP, their unique advantage, being able to have that LLM understand their domain, their context, and make material, use cases with their data. I think those are going to be the winners.
Totally agree. Yeah, good point, Oliver.
Awesome. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. A big thank you again to Conor and Oliver for leading such an engaging session. And of course, to all of you for joining us and contributing to the conversation. As was mentioned earlier, the recording of today's webinar will be sent to you via email. The full report is also out. It's called AI Today. Other than that, we look forward to seeing you all again at future events and webinars, and have a wonderful day, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks for joining, everybody. Thanks, Oliver.
Thank you.
Thank you.